also acknowledge my co-authors. I know Ben is actually in the chat, so feel free to pester him with questions while I'm talking. And also to acknowledge our co-authors in our design side who certainly helped us get the data into shape and gear and developing these approaches. So just to start with and to frame this discussion a little bit, to talk about our general aims, what we were really interested in this study was understanding to what extent our methods are aligning with our theories and frameworks of learning. And to that extent, we were very conscious of how we approach this. So I'm kind of reminded that in this capacity of the fable of the 5 blind scholars and the elephant, each looking at it in different ways and coming with somewhat different conclusions. And now this isn't necessarily new. This has been called upon by a lot of researchers. For instance, Alyssa in her 2015 piece talked about how it enables us to focus. It also allows for replication and design and adaptations of our designs and to understand insights into theory and practice as we approach. And now there, of course, are a lot of perspectives within learning. They're behavioral, cognitive, social, participation. But one of the most common use is self-regulated learning, which kind of looks at the organizational elements, how learners are planning and developing their strategies and organizing their study habits to actually achieve some kind of end. This obviously requires regulated processes and behavior and looking at them in the focus. So what do we mean by SRL? Well, we were kind of taking a very broad view of this. We were recognizing it as a phased process that involves identifying information, assessing information to how it meets to some standard or value, and how is that defined in terms of an assignment or an assessment activity or a task activity, developing connections and evaluating these connections over time. This occurs in phases. These phases aren't necessarily cyclical. Or these phases aren't necessarily sequential. They can occur in circles or relative to that. There's also a lot of different frameworks within SRL. I don't have time to go through each of these here, but essentially there are quite a wide array there. I've listed out some, such as Bill's and Zimmerman's and Paul Pitrick's. Now, how do we know it has even occurred? Well, one of the most common frameworks and methods that we have used has been self-report measures. So this includes things like surveys have been commonly used to develop and assess and measure self-regulated learning in practice and in research quite often. This also includes interviews and other things that are related to some task. Of course, we're all well aware that there are limitations within these approaches in that they're very introspective, they're reflective. We don't necessarily know if we have accurate insight into what we actually did in our task, or if we're constructing some sort of thing that's maybe somewhat inaccurate or is not as general. So in other words, we can't catch ourselves in the act. We have to kind of think about it after the fact, which has led to the rise and focus of looking at things like behavioral logs. Now these tend to have stronger associations with learning and outcomes. For instance, in our last year's LAC, we talked about how similar behavioral measures aligned with what the instructor knew about the student's behavior as opposed to what they were doing, and how that indicated insights into the achievement of students. And of course, a limitation of this approach is that they are very fine-grained and they do require some reconstruction into meaningful measures, which is commonly done through theoretical approaches and means. So naturally, the kind of question that we were seeking to answer here is, how do they compare? There has been previous work here, specifically Chu and Nguyen looked at this way back in 2012 and found that the behavioral logs were a better indicator of achievement than self-reports. Similarly, Gashevic in his study more recently found that they didn't necessarily identify what actually occurred as opposed to the intention or the perception of the intention to study and practice rather than the enactment of those intentions. But one of the things we noted in our review of this work is that it tended to be very much limited to a single class or a few class instances with a single design. So one of the questions we were seeking to address here is, well, how can we assess this over a broad array of students and practices within an actual learning system at an institution. So just to frame our approach, it involved kind of two approaches here. We took self-report measures that I'll get into in a moment, which we are kind of going with our top-down approach, and behavioral log data from Canvas at our institution in the university. And then we were going to compare them with just simple Pearson correlations of how aligned did these two, did they relate to one another through a simple factor approach. So getting into the behavioral measurements, we used quite a bit here. We included the ASSIST, the Grit Short Scale, the NSLQ, the LASI, the Study Behavior Inventory, and the self-efficacy for self-regulated learning survey measures in order to assess what the students were saying or reporting that their study habits were in context. And the reason we were using quite a bit of these is to catch sort of a wide net approach of how students were characterizing their study and learning patterns in these contexts across the various phases. So to get into a little bit of more detail, what we looked at is 415 students responded to these surveys within our psychological subject pool. Of those, we only were able to retain 192 because some were freshmen and didn't have behavioral data from the site we were looking at, which was spring 2019. We also were not able to include some of them just because their courses were not being used in Canvas. And then we estimated, based upon their response to each question item, the actual sort of mean subscale response through a Bayesian process that's described in the Liddell and Krushke piece, which I would highly recommend everyone to look at. If you're ever working with ordinal data, it kind of gives you a good insight to just get a very simple numerical representation of how a student responds within these surveys. And then conducted a simple factor analysis using a Lumen rotation. The details are actually within the paper, and developed a representation of the scores off of those subscales. So we found a 5-factor solution to be most appropriate. And we dubbed these deep processing, which included stuff like how they characterized they were using evidence, their motivation of elements and things like that. Of course, motivation, how they characterized their larger motivational processes, their test strategies, their level of anxieties when they were taking tests. Similar to this, motivation was related to that, was similarly to testing strategies and how they characterized they took tests and their anxiety level in that. Whereas the motivation was actually on, I start what I finish, I plan my routes out. Time management was how well they thought they managed their time, what they did in that time, whether they came up with regular plans. Cognitive strategies indicated things of like use of interest in evidence, seeking evidence, and just general cognitive strategy use, and that's hard to contain within those subscale measures. Now on to the bottom-up approach. What we looked at was 13 Canvas features, which there are various descriptions here. So this includes things like the amount of time they spent on assignment pages within Canvas, the time between when they first accessed an assignment and the deadline, how long they were within a particular session, how many requests they made to their site, how many submissions they had, things like that. These were all Z-scored in order to give an indication of when what the other course was doing. So that was just a standard transformation that we did by subtracting from the course level mean and the course level standard deviation. This did cause us to remove some additional features because, again, we discovered that there were cases where students were not really, the courses were not really using Canvas to get a good comparison. So this left us with 181 participants and 653 enrollments across the board. And then we identified a 3-factor solution for this place. And this included things of like visit frequency, which is how often do they come to a particular resource, such as an assignment, how long do they access it. Visit depth, what they did within the course site at that time, so that it can include things like the number of requests they made, how long their sessions were overall, and then concentration of effort. Now, concentration of effort is a little bit interesting in that it actually is kind of reflecting an inverse or a low rate of effort. So for instance, we noted that this was more related to higher number of submissions, larger periods of inactivity, and shorter periods of time between submission and deadline, indicating that maybe they weren't concentrating their effort over time as long in the Canvas site. So when we compare these two approaches, we found that there wasn't a lot of alignment. There were some cases, for instance, when we compared the actual features within Canvas to the factor solution on the survey or self-report measures, we find that the submission time from deadline has a moderate correlation or small level correlation between that and their motivation and their time management, in the sense of if they submitted closer to the deadline or further away from the deadline, they maybe tended to be more related to how they informed on their motivations, as opposed to their time management also relating to that. And also some negative correlations between, time between first access and deadline, and that if they were accessing later on, then maybe they weren't as motivated, or they didn't tend to manage their time as well. And in terms of the bottom level or behavioral log data and the self-report, again, there's, as you can see, not as much alignment and some more moderate cases. And then when we compared the overall factor scores between these two approaches, we found that there was very little alignment overall, except, again, some additional things in concentration of effort, insofar as this was kind of related to negative relationships, that they thought they managed their time kind of well, and that they tended to have a lower score on concentration of effort, and that they were actually planning out things in more detail, or that, as opposed to similar things within their motivation. So again, back to the elephant metaphor, what do we make of this? So what are we actually really measuring? We do see some extent of alignment insofar as we're really talking about behavioral alignment within these systems and our intended self-reports. But again, this doesn't necessarily lead to insights into the more indirect cognitive system or processes or intensive relationships that could exist within these things. Now, certainly there were limitations in our approach. It was kind of simple and straightforward. We were actually quite happy to learn that there had been a substantive review on this after our initial submission, and that maybe we're only getting as a general level of insight into what students do and plan within their studies, as opposed to an overall level of or of a specific level on what they did in a specific context. And then, of course, another thing is that we didn't really take into account when these things were occurring over time within Canvas. And that's a critical issue that has been raised by various authors and experts, leaders in the fields and learning analytics, as we need to be very attentive to not just what is happening, but when it is happening in relation to what other events have happened prior to that, which leads us to kind of think we need to expand this approach into a process mining strategy, which has been a somewhat novel approach that has been developed within learning analytics over time. There's just some references there, and I think there was another reference, another talk earlier today. Now again, these have constraints based upon a diversity of the design and learning approaches that have taken up into here, which is something that we were very attentive to since our data set was so large and expansive. So our next steps here are to be approaching what happened in sort of a process approach across a limited subset of about 6 psychology courses, and seeing how students' event behavior are actually related to their own self-report measures. I'll wrap it up there. And but before I wrap it up, I do just want to point out that we do have an open science forum post that I can put in the chat that has all our code and scripts and logs within the we did in this analysis, and we encourage anyone to take a look at that and provide comment, provide feedback, as well as welcome collaboration from anyone who wants to. And there's my email. Please don't hesitate to reach out.